Hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Good morning. My name is Leo Alves. I'm a software engineer at a company called Gideon. We are a Dutch company that does field service on behalf of other companies. I'll explain to you in a second, but I'll explain with more details in a second. But the whole idea of what we do is, let's say you're Vodafone, you're T-Mobile, and you need a technician to do some service, and you don't have that technician, you don't have those skills in-house, then we have some people, a lot of people on call that we can send on behalf of other companies to do any kind of field service. So you can think of things like furniture assembly, telecom, or solar panel installations, anything that is field service related. And we do a lot of that using Salesforce. And today I want to talk to you about a bit of a story, how we move into DX, how we broke down our monolith, and hopefully offer some inspiration on how you can do it yourselves. First of all, I want to talk about the motivation of this talk. I remember when DX first came out, I would see slides like this on webinars, and we'd be like, that's so cool, that's so exciting. We can finally modernize, we can finally do development more or less like everyone else is doing out there. But how do we do that? And then we would expect what's coming after the next slide. Okay, it's the how you do it. And then you go to the next slide, and then you would see something like this. Yes, you can break down your happy soup. You can go into modules. You can work into smaller packages, smaller projects. That's really cool. And the next slide, and the next slide, and then the presentation would be over. And then we would be like, okay, how do we do that? And it was quite frustrating for us as developers, as a company. Most of our people have been working with Salesforce for a while, but we also have a lot of people that have been doing a lot of things outside of Salesforce. So it was a very clear gap for us. And then we would just try, let's just say, let's try very small. Let's move a field. No, that doesn't make any sense. Let's try to move a class. A class makes more sense. It's code related. But then you see, shoot, that class has references to another 5 classes. And you're like, I'm going to bring this class and this 5. Okay, little package. And then you see that that class references some fields. You're like, bring fields in. Those fields reference standard objects to relationships. And then you all of a sudden, you have your monolith in DX. And you're like, I hate this. So how we did this? So motivation behind this talk is you tell us what the old state is. Cool. This is where we are right now. This is the old. But we have this new stuff, this new state, which does sound like a Nirvana. And we finally can shine. We finally can be enlightened. But how do we get there? Something happens halfway through, and we don't know why. And you're like, huh? How do we do that again? So back to who we are. So the company is called Gideon in Dutch, or Gideon in English. We do field service on behalf of other companies. So we have a system built in Salesforce that partners of ours can send requests to us. We process that request, and then we take that request for an installation, and then we contact the customer as if we were T-Mobile, as if we were Vodafone, as if we were IKEA's. And for the customer, it looks like they're talking to the company they hired the service from, but it's actually us. We find a technician, and we build both the customer and our partner. And that's through the background of everything we do. We do a lot of installations. We do thousands of installations in the Netherlands, and it doesn't look like it's us. And those are the 4 process of what we do. We receive a ticket, we plan a ticket, we execute a ticket, and we build a ticket. And all of that is done in Salesforce with some processes that are done outside. So this was our Salesforce setup, more or less until March 2018. It was more or less like this. We had field service Lightning, and we had Financial Force, which were the base of what we were doing. So I had the Salesforce, those 2 big packages installed, and then a bunch of stuff that we had built to connect those 2 from the moment a ticket installation comes in through an API to the moment that it gets built using Financial Force. And then we had a metadata API-based version control system using GitHub, where we kept our classes, triggers, Visual Force pages, track fields, anything we needed that we would say, everything that was needed for our code to compile. And if you create a new developer org, a new sandbox that was completely empty and push it there, it would compile, it would work, our test would pass. It was our partial source of truth, let's say. And we also had some functional changes, untracked fields, process builders, entitlement process and flows that did not, in theory, break that stuff. In practice, it was a bit more complicated. But that's more or less how our code architecture. And if you've been working with Salesforce for a while, you might have seen this kind of code architecture where you have an S-object service where you keep your code, your logic central, so like let's say a work order service. And you have all the methods for the work order in the work order service, and then you have a work order trigger handler that goes into the service, performs the logic, and then continues execution. You have some back job that goes into that service and does same thing. Everything was centralized around those service classes, as well as custom controllers that we had, and everything was very centralized around the idea of service. We had very big services and very small classes around it. And the same thing, I have an example as well. If you think case service, case trigger handler, anything around that whole idea of a centralized service. And our classes grew very, very fast. And we were like, okay, this DX thing came, let's try this. I'm very thankful to have a company that lets us try a lot of stuff. And we were like, let's try this. Let's take some time and try to take what we have. We took our org as it was because we just assumed we have everything that builds in source control and it works. We can push into the developer environment and it compiles. So why wouldn't it compile with DX? And we are like, let's try to do this. That was July 2017. And that was before that code architecture that I showed you guys. But when DX came out, we were like, there's no reason why we shouldn't try this. And we were like, okay, let's try to migrate the org fully. And we failed miserably, of course. Like, hands up who has failed trying to migrate a full org to DX. Right, and I'm very glad it failed, because if you think of migrating a monolith to a better monolith, it's still a monolith. It's still problematic. It doesn't solve the problems that DX is supposed to solve for us. And now that I look, it was such a frustrating experience for us as developers as well, because we have memes in our company of the photos of people before and after DX, that we just have crazy picture, like happy picture before DX, crazy picture after DX, just making fun of the whole experience that we had trying to migrate. And we said, forget this doesn't work. We went back to repeating that what we all said many times. Working with Salesforce is just too difficult. It's not what we want. Let's just keep going as it is and do the fun stuff outside the job. Just forget it. And then, first lesson about DX, do not try to migrate a full org. Even if you succeed, you are doing it wrong. Not supposed to have a full org into DX. And then you fast forward into the future, we have grown to about 900 metadata components. As a result, really slow deployments. We had really long classes, especially those service classes. It was very difficult to manage that. We had tests that took forever because every one of our tests was creating a lot of data in our database. And I don't know if you have experience working with Financial Force or field service lighting. You need to set up a lot of data before you can even test. And it was very difficult to onboard new people. It was very difficult to explain what was going on. And the knowledge was in the mind of myself, another developer, and a couple of other functional people. We didn't take the time or the priority to document stuff. And it was just very knowledge that was spread across in our heads. Because if somebody asked me, this field is not showing the right data. Every time I have these values, this happens. And we would say like, that's because A, B, and C. And can you document that? And it's like, sure. And then we didn't, because we had other things to do. And it was just knowledge that was in our heads, and it was very unstructured as well. When you ask somebody to write documentation, write unstructured documentation is very difficult because our code was unstructured. We had stuff that was tracked in source control, but because we had stuff that wasn't, we had no idea what was going on when we hit save. Our trigger handlers would run 6, 7 times. We're like, we have no idea why. And then it was very difficult to explain to especially our directors who didn't come from a Salesforce background, when they would ask us, why is this going on? And you're like, we don't know. And it's like, how come you don't know? We don't know. It's like, you're supposed to know this. I know, but we don't know, and that's not how Salesforce works. And it just grew, and it became unmanageable for us. And we realized that our code base was growing a lot. And we had, at that stage, implemented about 20% of our business in Salesforce, and another 80% to go. So we realized, hey, we have a problem here. So we told ourselves, maybe we should revisit that DX thingy. Let's see how it is. That was a year later. That was around, I think, April 2018 that we realized it was spring 2018. And it was around that time that Salesforce had just come out with second generation packaging. And then we told ourselves, this looks very interesting. I don't know if you know how second generation packaging works, but it's a bit beyond the scope of this presentation to explain everything that it can do. But the whole idea is that you create a metadata container for your deployment. It's like an immutable or a potentially mutable snapshot of your deployment. And you say, hey, this piece of code is frozen, and I'm going to deploy it into the org, and I'm going to install it into the org. And it's this version, and that's it. If you want to release it again on top of that version, you need to create a new version. And we thought that was very interesting. It sounded a bit more like what we wanted, like what other developers were used to, the whole idea of immutable artifacts that you can put into an org and say, hey, this is the version of the truth. It's this version 1.2. Let's deploy it into an org. And it was very interesting that you could create package dependencies as well. The whole idea that you can create a package that you can only deploy after you deployed its dependencies was also very interesting, because it showed us that we could look and remember how we deployed in open source technologies, and like, this is interesting. We started getting intrigued by it. And namespaces, we all heard the same thing about Salesforce. Salesforce cannot do namespaces. Salesforce and namespace for Salesforce are for ISVs. And it's not possible to have namespaces in Apex. We all heard this, and we all repeated this, to be honest. We heard that all you could do in Salesforce is use your global namespace, and that's all you had. You had to be really careful naming your classes because you had a limited number of namespaces. And we repeated the mantra. But at the same time, around that time, we saw this in Salesforce. We saw that every Salesforce DX package, a project, has a namespace on it. And it intrigued us because you saw, hey, if this is just for SVs, why is Salesforce making this available for everyone? And why is there in the org a new tab called Namespace Registries? If you look up here, it's a bit small. And why is there a button up here called Link Namespace? This something doesn't quite make sense. I think we're missing something. And there we looked and we discovered we can have namespaces in Salesforce as a customer. We didn't have to be an ISV. And that made things even more interesting. Then, first second about DX, and don't make assumptions. Make decisions based on facts. Read documentation, see what's out there. I know sometimes it's really frustrating because you can't find the right documentation, but once you've found that something is the way it is, then you can make a decision based on facts. We felt very embarrassed when we discovered there were namespaces that we could use because we kept saying that we couldn't. Right, and things are getting very interesting for us because we could have source-based development, the code as the source of truth. We can have immutable deployable snapshots. We can declare dependencies and namespaces, but still have 900 metadata components, not counting untracked. So we had, again, looking at one of my first slides, very good new state, the old state, what must happen in the middle. Didn't know. So code analysis time. We looked at this and said, it's time to try in a better way. What we did, we created a spreadsheet of everything of all of our Apex classes, and we designed a namespace schema where we said, if we had an ideal world, which namespaces in which namespaces would code live? So we'd have, for instance, in our work order service, we would have a method called post invoices. It was very clear that belonged in a finance namespace. And we would have, again, in a work order service, because we do a lot of things around work orders, we had a method called sync to logistics to do all our logistical checks to make sure that the products that our technicians had used were correct. And we just designed, we roughly had 4 or 5 namespaces on that idea, and we assign a namespace per class per method. So you're talking about 900 metadata components. The classes were most of those components, and we created a rough dependency tree by hand, which took quite a bit of time of our developers. We're talking about here, it was half a sprint of 2 people, myself and other developer included, that people came to us and we were too busy doing something, and we just ignored a lot of the requests. Oh, there's a really important bug. Is that really important? It's really important. How many times does it happen? It happens on one case. Do you have a workaround? I do. I'm sorry, it's not really important. We have something else here to do. And at that time, there was no dependency API, so for us to check the dependencies, which we have now, which is so much better. It would have made our lives so much easier back then. But this was the way we started. And then when we created that spreadsheet, we had a little plan. And which brings me to my third lesson. Get backup on this. Get somebody who has your back. In this case, we had a product owner who had our back. If it's your boss, it's your project manager, it's your director, have somebody who can also have your back when you say, I have no time to work on this. You're claiming to be very important because I have something more important to do that is related to the future of our application, how it's going to grow. So we had a plan. We had packages. We had a plan of how to create our packages because we had namespaces. And we just started packaging and migrating. Really, the way it works for you to create a package in Salesforce CX, you throw a bunch of classes into the Apex class folder or whatever folder you want to use. There is a dx command that you create a package from it, and that package becomes an installable artifact that you can have in your org. And it can be 2 classes, it can be 5 classes, it can be a few fields, it's up to you. I have here a bit of an example of how it would work, the way we started migrating. So if you look at this, we have a class that implements another class, that extends a class and implements an interface. And they're all inside, was all in the metadata API. And then when we create a package for the notification gateway, we had the namespace in front of it. And that's how we started migrating. We had a package for that notification gateway. We installed that package in production, and then, or first in a sandbox, most of the time. And then once we had it installed in the org, we were able to just change the references and push, and then it just worked. It was the first time it worked, we were in a bit of a high. We were like, I cannot believe I created a package, installed, and it worked the first attempt. And it was really nice because it was really small packages. We got too excited in the beginning. We had 20, 30 packages on the first month and we were like, I'm not sure this is a very good idea, but let's look into this. Right, and then it was time to, first we started what we called our commons namespace, if I show this again to you. This is the namespace where code lived that didn't really have any business logic, but it really helped us to code. So we have, for instance, a package called Apex Sugar, which is just sugar functions that do what we wish Apex did, but it doesn't. So we just threw, so for instance, we have a class there that extracts all the IDs from a list of S objects. And we didn't have to repeat that in every trigger handler. We just created a static method in a class that just extracted the IDs, and it's just called, it's a sugar function. And then it was time to look into the ticket namespace. It's cool. That's where the cool stuff was going on. It was the first package we migrated to a new namespace that actually contained business logic, and it was the first one that had fields and objects. And it was such a nice experience to do this because we had a few weeks or a few sprints of trying this and failing and trying again and succeeding. And then we started to go into a bit of like a bigger packages that weren't just sugar functions, it weren't just helpful functions. And you're like, let's do this. We installed in a sandbox, and to our surprise, if you install something in a namespace with the same field name, you get 2 fields. The old field, and you also have a new field. So let's say if I have a VAT field, VAT__C, and I have on my package finance a VAT field, I have a new field called finance__VAT_C, which was, again, a very big frustration. 4th lesson, data migrations, get very used to them. If you migrate to DX, you're going to have to do a lot of data migrations, at least if you decide to use namespaces, which My advice to you is to see data migration as not as an impediment, just see as part of modernizing your application development experience. It kind of sucks sometimes to do data migrations. It was a lot of weekends to migrate some of the stuff we were doing, but it was worth it because then we had stuff that was in our metadata API. We were able to lift that, put in the X, and go a lot faster with it. Which brings me to my next point, which is build feature toggles. They will help you migrate your data. So let's say if you need to turn off a trigger handler for a while, build that in the package. Have a metadata setting that says, hey, turn off trigger handlers, turn off the integration, turn off the APIs, return an error response from the API to say the API is down for maintenance. Make sure that you have feature toggles because they will make your data migration so much easier. Right, so talking about a bit of our best practices, we didn't quite follow Salesforce best practices on this because we didn't know how to do that best practices when talking about namespaces. First of them is we have one trigger per object per namespace. We thought we would have problems with this. It's still working. We have triggers running in the order that we expect them to. And we keep the business logic centralized because we are migrating stuff into code, into separate namespaces, into source control repositories, I'm sorry. It means the people are working on it, they're working with code. So we are saying if it's something is a central business logic to what we do, to what the namespace does, it must be in code. And there should be no inter-namespace dependency other than platform events. I'll explain that in a while why. And no code touches the database directly other than trigger handlers. So we don't have any references in fields other than inner trigger handlers. The reason being that we have some special classes. I don't know if any of you is familiar with the domain-driven design. Again, a bit outside of the scope of this presentation. So we work with domain-driven design. So we have classes that represents the behavior of database objects. And then inside, we do some magic to make sure to only commit to the database when you're ready to commit, instead of touching the database anytime we need it to change. And then we use the code in the org, in the metadata API, only for configuration. That is very specific to that org. So I have an example that I can show you in a while. So I think I messed up the order of the slides, but I'll show you in a while. So what about functional changes, you asked me? We still have functional consultants. We still have people, admins, working on it. One thing that DX and working with Namespace has helped us to change is the idea of a product and an implementation. So the teams that are coding, they are building a product with our POs. And the functional consultants, they are implementing the product for us. So you have a team or multiple teams that are building code, that are building a product, and then we say, hey, these are the features, this is how you use it, this is the invocable actions you have, this is how you can use what we have developed, and then the functional consultants can use process builders, can use headless flows, can do whatever they want inside the org, because the developers don't work in the org, they work with Scratch orgs, which provided a very interesting mindset change for the developers. Because all of a sudden we weren't thinking about the product that Gideon was building for Gideon, but this is a field service product that happens to be used by this company. What if another company was using it? Which turned out to be very good because later on we went into a joint venture with another company, and part of this joint venture agreement is that they would use our org as it was. So again, we had one product or multiple namespace products being used being developed by multiple teams, but let's say a ticket team would develop the ticket product, and then one org would use it in a different way than the other, which was fine because you had that whole mindset change. And this is our current architecture of code, just more or less how we are working right now. We have the commons namespace. As we saying to you, the whole idea is that you have code that is unopinionated that helps you to code. So we have the Apex Sugar library, we have our FFlibs, we use the FFlibs from Financial Force, and we have modified them a little bit to make them work for us. We use ForceDI from Andy Fawcett to be able to do dependency injection, and it's very non-opinionated code. Or you can say that it's a bit more opinionated, but the whole idea of the commons is that it doesn't really provide any business logic by itself. You can consume that, it will help you to develop. And then we have our utils, which are mini utility applications. Let's say we built one of our utilities that we have built a data scrambler that if you provide some settings to it and you provide a list of fields and a bunch of metadata, it will take those fields and it will scramble them based on a date type. And then we use that for GDPR. It's a mini application that could be generically used, and then we use it for GDPR in that case. And then we have a bunch of mini utils that do things that by themselves they don't provide any value. You just configure it based on your use case, and then you use it to solve a problem. And then we have the separate namespaces. If you see here, everything, the namespaces are built on top of those two basic big namespaces that are more generic. And you have our CRM namespace, logistics namespace, finance, and ticket. And we are always thinking about adding new namespaces because we see how our business is divided very clear right now into our code. And for every namespace, we have what we call the core package. And the core package is the core business logic for the namespace. So let's say every time a ticket is closed, we want to, every time a ticket is dispatched, we want to let the technician receive a notification. That is very central to our business logic to say, hey, it's been dispatched, but the notification itself is outside. So that's what we call the adapter packages that we say, hey, this talks into our core names, the core package of that specific namespace. And we also have a list of platform events. And the reason why you have platform events is to be able to say, let's say when the ticket is closed, I want to have a logistical check. We don't want the ticket stuff to depend on logistics and the other way around, but we should platform events to say, hey, ticket has been performed, it's done. And then logistics is listening to this, hey, it's time to do the logistical check. And then when it's done, it shoots a platform event, and then the finance process picks it up. Hey, it's time to bill. So we just have the dependency that's very thin on the platform event level, but not more than that. And I have here the example that I was talking to you earlier about how we use commons. So in the commons namespace, we have a notification gateway. If you look at this line here, we use a dependency injection framework to say, hey, every time you go to the notification application service and you want to get the configured notification gateway for a specific gateway, on this case, the only gateway that we have is the SMS. Whenever you ask for SMS, give me the configured instance of SMS gateway. And that lives in the GUI commons namespace, in our commons namespace. And there is no inside commons anything configured for SMS gateway. Then we go to the org itself. On the org itself, we do have a configured class that does extend the SMS gateway and implements the correct interface. And it just sends a bunch of SMSs. But again, our commons namespace doesn't know about the existence of that class. We have a metadata API record that is configured to say every time you ask for an SMS gateway, this is the instance of the class that should be returned. And then inside our ticket, in our ticket namespace, we have a class that asks to the GUI commons, hey, GUI commons notification gateway up here. Give me the configured notification gateway for SMS gateway. So if you think about this, you have commons, you have SMS, and say, hey, commons, give me what you have configured. It goes into the org and say, I have configured SMS gateway, a class that you don't know that exists. Go, and it works. When we saw that it works, we were like, wow, amazing. And about a little bit about the way we work. A namespace is exclusively controlled by a team. The reason being is that you want the business logic of how a namespace should behave to be controlled by a team. We do have let's say, the privilege to have a lot of developers working for us. And then we have about 12 developers working just in Salesforce, 6 developers that are non-Salesforce, and then some functional people as well. So we have a team of about 30 people. And so we can say one team owns a namespace, and they can own more than one namespace, but that namespace can only be owned by one team. As I said, the common namespace is everything where everything can depend on, and there should be no other inter-namespace dependency other than platform event declarations. Otherwise, it just gets too complicated with all the dependency management. And then how you stitch things up. Use the platform events for communications that are asynchronous, and HTTP callouts inside the org for communications that are synchronous. If you think about the analogy of microservices, right? We would consider almost like a namespace as a microservice that you can say, hey, I want to check with that service a specific result. We do a HTTP callout inside the org, get the result. We don't know that's a different namespace. We're just calling an endpoint, and we are listening to platform events to be able to react asynchronously on what happens on different namespaces. And a bit of some caveats. Creating a namespace creating a package can take a long time. So what DX showed us is that we can go a lot faster when it comes to development, but releasing a lot of packages that have a lot of dependencies on them takes quite a while. So we are talking about here creating a package takes about 45 minutes, where a metadata deployment of our form metadata will take half an hour. And that's just one package with, like, let's say, another 5 dependencies. So just be aware of that. If you start working with second generation packaging, you might take longer in how you deploy. And there are no local tests that are run in the org when you install something in the org, which does make sense. If you install, let's say, Financial Force in your org, Financial Force doesn't know about your tests. So it's the same idea. If you're developing a product and you install it in an org, no tests will get run on that org. And we discovered that it was faster to wait for the business person to run to us to scream that something is going on than running the local tests in the org. So what we do, we install and we look at the door and we just wait. And it's like, okay, I think we're safe. So be aware of that. We have broken our org a few times that we're like, but there are no test fails. But it shouldn't be, because that code is a deployable snapshot that you're putting somewhere. And if you're thinking of a product mindset, you're installing it somewhere. That's where integration tests come in. That's where in your sandbox, you can install a package and run your integration tests. And then you can access stuff in your namespace and make sure that things are working the way they should. And then there's the other side of dependency management. We have 83 packages installed in production today. And we have created 900 package versions in the last year. A little less than a year. So we also are learning a bit of our lessons of getting too excited about creating too many packages. And a few lessons we learned along the way, some things, last things I want to share with you. First one, stop with the is not ready attitude. Salesforce is not developing exclusively for you. Salesforce is developing for everyone. It's a platform where a lot of people are developing. We have a lot of customers in Salesforce. And because of that, sometimes I hear a lot from fellow Salesforce professionals that say to me, oh no, Salesforce, this is not ready for us. It's like, okay, stop a little bit with the attitude of, no, it's not for me. Because if you don't start, if you don't try to take what they give you today, you're going to be more stuck in the past than you are right now in the future, because time will have passed. And start small, but start on Monday. Just take a couple of things, see what those classes are that don't have any dependencies, create a little package, create a sugar package, and have the experience of what it is to develop in that way, in that mindset in Salesforce. It's so much more exciting. One thing that we noticed is happier developers. One thing that we were blown away by is that we weren't recruiting actively, and we were getting CVs of people and say, hey, we heard of the stuff you're doing in Gideon. Can I come in for an interview? And you're like, of course you can come in for an interview. And we were more excited to hear about what they heard than actually talk to them. And we had, out of my personal experience, I was quite tired of my career in Salesforce because I was tired of building stuff in a sandbox. But this was quite a step forward in Salesforce development. And you get happier people who are developing in a much more modern way. And you also have better for the careers of the people in your company, because you know what, if you're developing in something that's a bit stuck in the past and you don't modernize, people are going to lose their interest because you end up looking out there. There's so much money you can offer to your people to stay to do something they don't quite enjoy. There's not a lot of best practices on this. We are the people who get to create them. We are the people that get to invent them for the first time. we have no idea if the things we're doing at Helium are the right practices. They are working for us, but I can't say to you, hey, this is the way to do it, because as far as I'm aware, I can't see any best practices out there. So be aware of that. When you're looking for best practices, you might not find them. As I said, get comfortable with data migrations, create tools. If you don't want to create tools, just get used to them. It's going to pay off when you're done with most of them. Automate the shit out of things, you can now. And my last lesson, be a developer working in Salesforce. Do not be a Salesforce developer. There is a wealth of knowledge out there in how to design a system, design patterns, a lot of books. It's not about going into Salesforce blogs and say, hey, how can I build a trigger handler that does this? It's about saying, hey, how can I build a sustainable system that will grow, that will make our people happy, and that I'll be proud of. Does anyone have any questions?
You said about the fields getting namespaces. Is that true of classes and everything else, right? So if you have a class in your org, and you package up that class with a namespace, do you then have to remove the original class?
So the question was if I told about the fields being namespace, and then if the classes are also namespaces, and so that means that I will have two versions of the same class, one that is namespace, one that is not. Yes, that is correct. You will have to delete the old classes when you migrate. When the example that I showed with the namespace in the front, we still had to remove that dead code. It's dead code, it's not being used, it's not being referenced, but you still have to remove it.
Yeah. Did you find that you had circular dependencies between packages?
The question, did I find that I had circular dependencies between my packages? A few times in the beginning, yes, which were more related to our design, that it was fine to just have one thing that references another thing that references this thing that references, which was how we were building. And then we had to have a different mindset about how we were building.
When you had your separate packages, you were talking about using HTTP calls for synchronous calls?
Yep.
That's just could you explain that?
Yes, so question is, I did talk about having our namespaces and talking to different namespaces using HTTP callouts. So from our perspective, a namespace, I didn't know about the existence of the other namespace. I'm inside ticket, I don't know there is a logistical namespace. I know there is a logistical system, there is an API for it, I'm gonna call it. And then I need some data from it. And then from our perspective, it was just an endpoint. So it was to keep things decoupled. Otherwise, we would have to go into that namespace and then actually reference classes. One thing we are looking into, instead of using that, is using the new callable interface using commons. So we go through commons, get the dependency for a specific method for a specific class, and then retrieving that without having to do a HTTP callout.
The HTTP is a bit crazy, isn't it? Calling yourself over HTTP.
Yeah, we are aware that we haven't, the synchronous communication is something that we are aware we haven't really figured it out yet fully. For asynchronous, it's quite easy with platform events.
How did you handle standard objects? So for instance, opportunity data from which namespace?
So question is, how do we handle standard objects? So from our perspective, an object doesn't live on a namespace, but fields do. So we would have financial fields inside a work order. We had ticket fields inside of a work order, and we had logistic fields inside a work order. So we didn't break it down based on object level, but based on field level. Hey.
Was there any issues with things you couldn't package?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Anything you couldn't package?
So anything we couldn't package. In the beginning, there was, for instance, entitlement object. We couldn't have any references to entitlement objects. So the workaround for that we did while we were packaging is to use dynamic apex, which was what we thought a bit of an ugly solution, but then as Salesforce is releasing new support to new objects, we are just referencing them. I think we are running out of time.
1 minute.
One more question?
One more question.
Yes.
You mentioned that you have references to other packages and especially other vendors like Financial Force. Have you saw any increase? And you mentioned mentioned that some packages take a while to install,
Yeah.
right? Have you found any solution on get around that, or you just
We haven't had. I know Salesforce's question is if we have packages that because they take so long, if we have found a solution to work around the fact that they take so long. So we haven't come up with a solution yet. We know Salesforce is working on something that is called an org snapshot, scratch org snapshot, that is supposed to make things a lot faster. We're really looking forward to that. It does sound like the whole idea of if you know how container technology container technologies work, is that you have the snapshot of an image, and then you spin up a container based on that image, and you can cache that container. It's something we're really looking forward to, but sometimes when we need to start a new scratch org, we have to wait an hour, and that's just, it's a price we pay for a better development experience. And I think because we are out of time, thank you very much. If you have any more questions, I'll be here in the